Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning, I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On January 3rd, 1521, Pope Leo X signed a document that would change the world, Decet Romanum Pontificem, the papal bull formally excommunicating Martin Luther from the Catholic Church. At that moment, a German monk who challenged church practices became a heretic, cut off from the only religious institution most Europeans had ever known. And here's what fascinates me about this moment. Martin Luther believed he was defending Christianity. Pope Leo X believed he was defending Christianity. Both men thought they were protecting the faithful from corruption and error. Understanding what happened requires holding multiple truths. Luther's arguments about church corruption were largely accurate. The Pope's concerns about preserving Christian unity were legitimate, and the excommunication unleashed forces that would fracture Christendom in ways neither man could have imagined. All three are true, all three matter. Picture this. It's a winter morning in Rome. Pope Leo X, a Medici prince who'd been made a cardinal at 13, signs his name to a document declaring Martin Luther, a monk Leo has never met, a heretic and excommunicate. In Germany, Luther's fate is sealed, but he doesn't yet know it. The document will take weeks to reach him. When it does, he'll face a choice that haunts anyone who's ever stood against institutional power. Submit and keep your place in the community, or hold to your conscience and lose everything. Think about the position Luther was in. He wasn't trying to destroy the church. He'd posted his 95 Theses on that church door in Wittenberg 4 years earlier as an invitation to scholarly debate, the way academics had debated for centuries. His complaint? The sale of indulgences, certificates that supposedly reduced time in purgatory in exchange for money. The sales pitch was brazen. Johann Tetzel, the Dominican friar selling indulgences in Germany, had a jingle. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Buy an indulgence, and your dead grandmother's suffering in purgatory would be reduced. The church was literally telling people they could buy their way out of punishment for sin. To Luther, this perverted everything Christianity taught about grace and salvation. But Luther's theses went deeper than mere criticism of a corrupt practice. He was questioning the entire theological foundation. If salvation came through God's grace freely given, as Scripture seemed to say, then what was purgatory really? What authority did the Pope have over souls after death? These weren't just academic quibbles. They struck at the heart of how the Church understood its own power and purpose. But here's the complexity. From the Pope's perspective, Luther had become far more than an academic critic. In those 4 years, printing presses had spread Luther's ideas across Germany faster than any church official could respond. Luther wasn't just questioning indulgences anymore. He was challenging the Pope's authority itself. He'd written that Scripture alone was the ultimate authority, not church tradition or papal decrees. He'd suggested priests should marry. He'd argued that salvation came through faith alone, not through the elaborate system of sacraments and rituals the Church had developed over 1,000 years. Leo faced an impossible situation. The Church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the primary unifying force in a fractured Europe. It provided education, charity, hospitals, and the only social safety net most people knew. Latin Mass was the same from Ireland to Poland. Church law operated across borders. Letting one monk redefine doctrine threatened to unravel it all. The way I see this, both men were trapped by circumstances larger than themselves. Let me build the clock for you, because the excommunication didn't happen in a vacuum. By 1521, the Catholic Church had been the dominant institution in Western Europe for over a millennium. It had survived barbarian invasions, navigated complex political alliances, and built a theological system of tremendous sophistication. It had also accumulated enormous wealth and power. The sale of indulgences, Luther protested. That was funding the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Germany in 1521 wasn't really Germany. It was hundreds of semi-independent territories within the Holy Roman Empire, each with its own prince. These princes resented having to send money to Rome. They resented the church's tax exemptions and its ownership of vast lands. Some of them saw in Luther's rebellion an opportunity. Here's what the evidence shows. When Pope Leo issued the bull Exsurgia Domine in June 1520, giving Luther 60 days to recant, Luther publicly burned the bull. This wasn't just academic disagreement anymore. This was open defiance. The January 3rd excommunication was Leo's only remaining option. But Luther had protection. Prince Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who'd never even met Luther but valued the University of Wittenberg, where Luther taught, refused to hand him over to Rome. This was partly about genuine religious conviction. Frederick thought Luther deserved a fair hearing. But it was also about political independence from papal authority. What troubles me about studying this moment is how quickly religious conviction and political calculation became impossible to separate. Were German princes protecting Luther because they believed in his theology or because challenging Rome served their interests? The answer, frustratingly, is both. People rarely act from purely noble or purely cynical motives. Think about what excommunication meant. It wasn't just being kicked out of church. It meant your soul was in mortal danger. It meant you couldn't receive communion, couldn't have a Christian burial, couldn't participate in any sacrament. Your children couldn't be baptized. In an age when nearly everyone believed in hell as a literal, eternal reality, excommunication was a death sentence for your soul. More immediately, it meant secular rulers were supposed to enforce the church's judgment. Technically, once excommunicated, Luther could be arrested, tried, and executed as a heretic, burned at the stake like Jan Hus had been a century earlier for similar challenges to church authority. And think about what this meant for ordinary people caught in the middle. You're a baker in Wittenberg. You've heard Luther preach. His sermons make sense. The idea that God's grace is free, that you don't need to buy your salvation. But now the Pope says Luther is a heretic. If you support Luther, are you damning your own soul? If you reject Luther because the Pope says to, are you turning your back on truth? Families split over this. Towns divided. Priests who agreed with Luther had to choose between their convictions and their livelihoods. But this is where historical contingency matters. A few years earlier, Luther probably would have been arrested and executed. By 1521, though, printing presses had made him famous across Germany. His writings were bestsellers. He tapped into frustrations that went far beyond theological arguments about justification by faith. Arresting him risked a popular uprising. The Diet of Worms, the Imperial Assembly, where Luther was summoned to recant, happened a few months after his excommunication. Luther stood before Emperor Charles V and the assembled princes of the Holy Roman Empire. His most famous statement, whether or not he actually said these exact words, captures the heart of the matter. Here I stand. I can do no other. I find myself thinking about that phrase. Luther was saying he literally couldn't recant, not because he was stubborn, but because his conscience wouldn't allow it. He believed recanting what he knew to be true would be a sin greater than any punishment the church could inflict. We're still living with the consequences of that January day in Rome. The Protestant Reformation that followed Luther's excommunication didn't just split Christianity into Catholic and Protestant. It fundamentally changed how people thought about authority, conscience, and truth. If individuals could interpret Scripture for themselves, what other authorities could they question? The Reformation helped create space for individual conscience that would eventually extend beyond religion into politics and science. But that came at a cost. The religious wars that followed killed millions. The 30 Years' War alone devastated Germany so thoroughly that it took generations to recover. Communities that had lived together for centuries tore themselves apart over doctrine. Catholics and Protestants burned each other at the stake. The religious unity that Pope Leo feared losing was shattered, and the violence was catastrophic. Today, we take religious pluralism for granted in much of the world. We assume people have the right to worship according to their conscience or not worship at all. That assumption was born in the aftermath of Luther's stand. But it took centuries of bloodshed to get there. Europe only arrived at religious tolerance after exhausting every alternative. The question of conscience versus institution still haunts us. When do you comply with institutional authority, even when you think it's wrong? When do you stand on principle, knowing the cost? We see this in corporate whistleblowers who expose fraud and lose their careers. We see it in military personnel who refuse orders they believe are illegal. We see it in scientists who challenge established theories and risk professional ostracism. We see it in journalists who publish classified information they think the public needs to know. Every one of these situations forces the same impossible choice Luther faced. Your conscience or your community, your principles or your security. And just like in 1521, the answer is never apparent. Sometimes whistleblowers are heroes exposing genuine wrongdoing. Sometimes they're reckless actors who don't understand the whole picture. Often they're both. Luther's excommunication teaches us something uncomfortable. Sometimes both sides of a profound conflict are partially correct. The Church was right that fracturing religious unity would have terrible consequences. Luther was right that corruption and theological error needed to be challenged. Both men acted according to their deepest convictions, and the result was both liberation and catastrophe. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, himself a Protestant, writing 3 centuries after Luther, wrestled with this tension. He wrote, "The tyrant dies and his rule is over, the martyr dies and his rule begins." Luther became both a heretic to Rome and a hero to reformers. But Kierkegaard understood something crucial. The choice between conscience and community is never clean. Every act of conscience creates casualties. Every defense of institutional unity can perpetuate injustice. What strikes me about January 3rd, 1521 is how human it all was. Pope Leo X wasn't a cartoon villain. He was an educated, sophisticated man trying to hold together an institution under unprecedented stress. Martin Luther wasn't a flawless hero. He was brutal, often harsh, and his later writings on Jews were unconscionable. But in that moment, each man faced an impossible choice and chose according to his understanding of truth. Both things are true. The Reformation Luther sparked eventually led to greater religious freedom and the elevation of individual conscience. It also triggered wars that devastated Europe and created new forms of religious intolerance. The Catholic Church, which he challenged, remained corrupt in many ways. It also continued providing education, charity, and community to millions. History keeps teaching us this uncomfortable lesson. Most consequential decisions happen in the murky space between clear right and wrong. Luther's excommunication didn't create heroes and villains. It created tragedy, the kind that emerges when genuine convictions collide and no compromise is possible. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, ask yourself, when was the last time you thought you had to choose between your conscience and your community? How did you decide? And would you make the same choice again? Because that's what Luther's excommunication teaches us. Not just about religious freedom, but about the terrible price we sometimes pay for being true to ourselves. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.